Alright, welcome everyone. Hafadai, good afternoon, and talofa. My name is Ioane Tumanogi, and I will be your moderator for this session. I'm from American Samoa EPA. It's an honor for me to welcome all of you to this session about developing zero waste communities. As you all know, well, us islanders, we generate a lot of trash and solid waste. And solid waste management in the islands is a challenge because of limited space. So zero waste is a wonderful initiative to help us combat the solid waste management problem in the islands, as well as climate change. And it costs a lot to manage solid waste and manage landfills, so it'll help with the economy as well. So without further ado, I would like to welcome you to this session. And also, if you look on your agenda on your smartphones on Wuba, you'll see that we have some wonderful speakers from all sides of the world, not only in the blue continent, but the UK. So it's an honor for me to introduce to you our first speaker for today, Mr. Matt Pryor. Matt, how long did you fly to get here?
It was about 16 hours.
16 hours, ladies and gentlemen. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about this wonderful gentleman right here. He's the head of discipline for resource and waste management at Jacobs Infrastructure in the UK. His responsibilities include oversight for technical development for a team of 25 professionals working on a diverse range of infrastructure projects in the public and private sector. He has personal project responsibility for resource efficiency and circular economy projects, working with the Scottish Government through Zero Waste Scotland, as well as water projects working in highways, aviation, and with the UK local authorities. Matt has over 18 years of professional experience and is a chartered waste manager. All right, without further ado, here's Matt for his presentation this afternoon.
Thank you for that introduction, Ioane. Very undeserved, but thank you. Hello to everyone. It's an honor to be here and have the opportunity to speak at the conference. And thank you very much to Guam EPA and Conchita for giving me the opportunity to speak today. So I'm going to talk about zero waste in Scotland. And there's an awful lot that I could talk about, many sort of different aspects to cover. But what I really wanted to focus in on today is what I, from perspective and reflection of the work that's taken place, is the key contributors. Thank you, John. The key contributors to the zero waste program in Scotland. Zero waste is very much a journey in Scotland. It's not an end state, but the progress that's been made wouldn't have happened without the involvement of government, of education and academic institutions, of businesses, and the communities and the people of Scotland. So I thought I'd start with a very brief introduction to Scotland. I don't know if many of you have been there. It's a wonderful country. It's got a very diverse range of sort of historic cities and some iconic infrastructure, but also some extremely remote communities in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland. And in preparing for today, I looked up a few lesser known facts about Scotland. I certainly didn't know these, but Scotland actually has nearly 800 islands, particularly on the western and northern coasts, all part of the zero waste journey. Has the oldest building in the United Kingdom on Orkney, which is 3000 BC that was built. Elvis Presley made his only ever visit to Scotland, landing for about 2 hours at one of the airports. And the national animal of Scotland is the unicorn. and that's a fact. So, but the final point about the facts is that in 1999, the Scottish Government was set up, Scottish Parliament was reconvened after nearly 300 years. And that's a really important point for sort of launching into zero waste, because one of the issues that was devolved to the Scottish Parliament was environment. So they, from that point on, had complete control over the environmental programme, the environmental legislation for Scotland. So what does that look like in terms of government? Well, after about sort of 10 years, the fruition of the first phase of that was the production of the Zero Waste Plan in 2010, and that really set the vision in terms of how the Scottish Government wanted Scotland to manage resources for the benefit of the environment, but also for the benefit of the economy in Scotland. And that set the targets that needed to be addressed, and some very challenging targets there, some very high recycling targets, 75% recycling by 2025, a focus on separate collections of different materials, glass, cans, plastics. Also a plan to ban certain materials going to landfill in the longer term. And that was then reinforced with legislation in 2014 which implemented that and put in place the requirement for householders and businesses to be separately collecting different recyclable materials, and for most businesses to also collect separately food waste. But they then went a step further in 2016 and produced this orange document in the middle called Making Things Last, which is a circular economy strategy for Scotland. And this was a really interesting, groundbreaking move by the Scottish Government to adopt the circular economy, which there's many definitions for this. I would define it as keeping materials in value within an economy for longer. So if you took an example of a mobile phone, for instance, there are facilities in Scotland where phones can be broken down and the component materials can be recovered, the rare earth metals, other valuable materials in there for recycling. But in doing that, the value of that compared to the original phone has been lessened. And what the circular economy is trying to promote is to look at actually maybe, for example, repurposing that phone and reusing that within its original use, and thus keeping a much higher value of that and keeping it within Scotland. And alongside that plan that came out, the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, SEPA, also produced their regulatory strategy in 2016, which is called One Planet Prosperity. And that set out how they wanted all businesses to comply, their plan to help the businesses be robustly complying with the environmental legislation in Scotland, but they also set out a plan to work with the businesses to go beyond just environmental compliance and look where there are opportunities to profitably make sustainable use of the materials that they're managing. And many of the sectors that plan targeting complement what's in the Zero Waste Plan. So how's that being implemented? Well, this leads into Zero Waste Scotland. So Zero Waste Scotland is an arm's length company set up by the Scottish Government. It's based in Stirling. That's a nice shot. That's not all of them, but that's a kind of shot of the staff there. And they've been set up to look with the objective of looking at resources, waste, energy and water, and looking at how people and businesses can use those more efficiently and help progress towards a sustainable and low carbon economy in Scotland. And they've been a key actor in bringing government and businesses and the communities and education together to promote the zero waste progress in Scotland. And they've done that in a number of ways, one of which is through having regular conferences and engagement with community and with businesses. This was an event that took place last year in Scotland, which was the Circular Economy Hotspot. It was a great event. Over 400 delegates attended from over 25 countries, learning about the circular economy, learning about the innovations taking place in Scotland, but also hearing about what was happening elsewhere, much like we're doing this week. to learn and share best practice. And we had a keynote speaker there, which is Nicola Sturgeon, so that's our First Minister in Scotland. They've also set up from 2013 a Resource Efficient Scotland programme. This is a major programme working with businesses looking to help them use their energy and their water and their resources more efficiently to have a better, prevent waste and have a better environmental outcome, but also save money for the businesses. There's a very wide-ranging programme. I've just focused in one element there, which is construction. So the construction programme alone, construction waste in Scotland is over half of the waste produced. It's got a very high diversion rate, but it's still, there's half of the waste there. And so the programme is really looking at saying, well, what are the reasons for that? Why is there so much waste? And actually, when you delve into it, there's an awful lot of wasted materials that are going into construction landfills and construction recycling. When those materials, if recovered before they ended up as waste, would save the businesses money. So we worked with, over the past 3 years, over 100 businesses, looking at their practices, looking at where they could use their materials more sensibly, more securely to avoid it becoming waste. And within that programme, there was over 100,000 tonnes of waste savings identified, and over 200,000 tonnes of material savings identified. And when we did some analysis on that, that was an estimate of potentially over £10 million worth of material savings there. But alongside government, education is really important. It was recognised early on that in order to raise awareness around the zero waste and resource efficiency, there was a need to be engaging with adults, with children, with businesses, with government and local authorities to make people aware about the impacts of waste and the sustainable options that were available for them. So Zero Waste Scotland, working with the government and RAP, set up the Love Food Hate Waste campaign. And this is a very large awareness raising campaign. Had national advertising, local advertising, looking to sort of raise the issues around food waste. The estimates that led to this being set up indicated that Scotland was wasting over Scottish households were wasting over 500,000 tonnes of food just going into waste. And the analysis suggested that 2/3 of that was food that could have been eaten still. And for example, there was over £100 a year of food that was in the bins that was just unopened food. They're just being thrown out straight away. So they really took this on board. There's a specific target about food reduction, and the education pack that you see on the right there rolled out to all schools, running from primary, so that's from 5 years old up to 16, 17 when Scottish school children leave secondary education. And there's a whole range of education materials and lesson plans. So in primary 1 with 5 and 6 year olds, for example, you might have a lesson where you're looking at the life cycle of a strawberry, how it gets through the different processes to your plate and then through to disposal. Time they get to secondary school, they've got some lessons around setting up a persuasive ad campaign, how they would try and influence different groups to focus in on preventing food waste. But it wasn't just children. The man you've seen on the left there, that's Gary McLean. He's the national chef of Scotland. He's also the winner of BBC MasterChef for Professionals, so very proud of that. And he has worked with the campaign, set up a number of tutorials about how to use food more wisely, how you can cook and prepare food in a way that would prevent waste. So he did a nice tutorial about Christmas dinners. There's a lot of waste around that in Scotland, and some tips on how to use leftovers and party food, etc. There's also been a focus, though, within the wider Scottish Government initiatives about plastics. That's very much an issue in the agenda in Scotland, as it is here. And through Keep Scotland Beautiful, who run the Eco Schools initiative in Scotland, they worked with a author and songwriter Helen Graham to develop a musical that took a different perspective on plastics and to maybe engage school children in a different way through looking at the origins of plastics and why we use them and why we've got the impacts we have today, but very much finishing with a message of hope around what we can do to prevent the impacts of those plastics. And thus by doing this, they've approached it in a different way. It can be used in English lessons, in drama lessons, and bring in a different perspective on the issue. It's not just secondary and primary education, though, that it's important. The academic sector in Scotland is extremely vibrant. There's some world-class universities and institutions doing some great research. And alongside that, through the Scottish Government in 2013, they set up a series of innovation centres. Each of these normally linked to a university in Scotland and working on a particular sector, working to look at research that would introduce some innovation that would help to promote waste avoidance. So as an example, the Industrial Biotechnology Innovation Centre down there on the right-hand side, they worked with a company who saw an opportunity to take langoustine shells. So langoustines are these big juicy prawns, delicious up in Scotland. They took the shells and through a process working with bacteria, they were able to derive a product called chitosan from the shells. And chitosan is regularly used as a antimicrobial agent in food spoilage. So they've taken a waste byproduct and they've found an added value out of that waste byproduct which can go back into the economy in Scotland. I should also mention at that point the Scottish Institute for Remanufacture was set up. That works alongside Strathclyde University in Glasgow. It's one of only 6 in the world. And they're looking with businesses on research to remanufacture, redesign products to avoid waste and put materials back into use. So an example there, they've been working with a company called the Turbo Guy, who, surprise, surprise, takes turbochargers from cars, and they've been able to recondition those so that they can be reused again. And finally on education, I thought it would be worth just highlighting that Scotland has a Climate Change Act and has carbon targets within there. The government, working with Zero Waste Scotland, decided to look at the carbon related to waste, and they developed what's called the carbon metric. And what this does is it looks at the life cycle of the waste, so it's looking both at its uses and its disposal in a way that maybe is more comprehensive than maybe a territorial-based carbon emissions reporting you might get under the greenhouse gas protocol. And they did that because they wanted to try and understand another tool that would help them understand where the intensity of use of waste, or the intensity of the waste that they're producing was greatest in terms of the carbon impact. So, for instance, inert waste is a very high tonnage when considered by weight, but actually the proportion of carbon emissions from that is actually less compared to, say, food and animal wastes. And it's been a useful tool to help target where decisions could be made to target zero waste more effectively. As you can see from the top graph, the dark blue line at the top is the carbon, the bottom line is the tonnage trend over the last 5 or 6 years, and it's been coming down, but there's still a long way to go in terms of reducing that carbon impact further. Alongside education, there's been enormous amount of work by businesses in Scotland. So they've been driving a lot of innovation, a lot of really, really smart ideas to actually take on waste as a material, avoid it actually becoming a waste at all. This is an example here of a company called Kenetech. This is a new startup company who have developed an unfired brick So compared to a traditional clay-fired brick in Britain, there's a lot less energy in its production, but it also has over 90% recycled content. And they've been working very hard to get this through building standards, accreditation, and testing it, and demonstrate that it would meet the standards in the UK, which they've now done. And they're looking for this to commercialise and go out to the market later in this year. This is an interesting example. Part of some work that was done in Glasgow, mapping all the materials and waste in the city. What they found was that there was a lot of baking, there's also a lot of brewing. Those brown rolls you can see there are a Scottish delicacy, a morning roll, very nice with bacon or a bit of square sausage, but they were having a lot of unused rolls at the end of the day. And then working with the brewers at Jaw Brew, they were able to identify a way that they could use those waste rolls in a new blonde beer, which Jaw Brew have then commercialised and you can now buy. So they've avoided waste, they've increased their profits, and we've all got more beer to drink. This company, Dryden Aqua, now this is different. This is they've developed a really clever solution around filter media for wastewater treatment and water treatment. And the waste link here is that they use and remanufacture green and brown glass, which through that process they've been able to demonstrate has got an improved performance efficiency compared to sand as a filter media. And they've got a number of projects where that's been rolled out. But alongside that, they've also set up a social enterprise, and one of the managing directors had, called Clean Water Wave, which is developing a low energy filter which could be deployed in very remote and potentially economically deprived communities without large installation costs, and all that using this recycled glass at the heart of its process. Again with glass, so this company here, they've taken the fronts of TV screens and through a process of tumbling them and smoothing them off, they've been able to produce a very nice aggregate product which they can use in borders and garden projects. And there's an example from Glasgow of that with this aggregate product which has come from those sources. This is last of the businesses that I'll cover. This is a really interesting project. This man here, John, he has set up a new business that is looking to target difficult plastics, so things like chairs, toys, mop handles, mop buckets, and he's through this process that they're developing, they're able to produce a new source of recycled polymers, of PET, of HDPE, which can then increase the amount of plastic that's going back into recycling in Scotland and limit these plastics from ending up in illegal dumping or in landfill and places that we don't want. I'm going to skip over a couple because I'm just conscious on time, and I did want to talk a little bit about some community projects because, again, the community's been at the heart of what's been going on around the zero waste agenda in Scotland. So there's 4 businesses that are doing zero waste or low waste objectives in their own right. Glasgow Wood Recycling takes wood from train lines and from construction projects and turns it into very attractive garden furniture. But they've actually set up a workshop in Glasgow where they bring in community, the unemployed in the community, and give them training in carpentry, which is addressing kind of social exclusion and unemployment issues. Likewise, this company, Retech, on the right-hand side up here, they take on computers, laptops, phones, and they refurbish them, and they're a successful business now. But they've set up a new service which is called LeaseTech, where they are refurbishing older models at very low cost to then put into charities and third sector organisations that maybe can't afford the cost of new computers. And then finally, I just wanted to highlight the Zero Waste Towns initiative. So this has been a program run by Zero Waste Scotland. With some initial funding, they found a partner in a town and set up a program to really target community activity around the zero waste agenda. And they've set these up in Dunbar and Leith, on the island of Bute, and also in Stirling. And they run a whole series of campaigns, such as the Clear Out and Pass It On campaign. They also work very hard to leave a legacy from the project. So once the funding's finished and it carries on within the town, they're looking for that legacy. So in Dunbar, where that's the actual funding's finished, they had a zero waste hub that was bringing in and providing all sorts of things from the community, so clothing and books and tools and even some sportswear. And the company Mixer have taken that on, and that's still operating successfully in that community. So there's so much to talk about, but I'm conscious on time, so I've sort of skipped over a few of them. I can come back to those later if anyone's got any particular questions on them. I guess there's been a lot of progress in the last 10 years, but there's a lot to do. As you can see, those are some of the targets that are still to come, and there's a lot of work to take Scotland forward to that. In the last year, in the last couple of years, recycling has actually outstripped landfill, but it's not up to these levels yet, so there's a lot of progress to make. And I think the final observation is that recently in the United Kingdom there's been a real renewed focus around the climate impact, the climate emergency, a big movement with school children campaigning, led by some of the amazing inspiration from a schoolgirl in Sweden called Greta Thunberg. And in light of that, the Scottish Government have recognised that and acknowledged that there's a climate emergency and are looking to review the Climate Act targets to aim for net zero carbon by 2045. And I think on the back of that, I would expect there to be further initiatives to come to try and bring zero waste as a contributor towards that target. Thank you very much for your time.
Hold on to your questions until after the session, and then you can ask questions to our panel. Our second presenter comes to us from the beautiful Aloha state of Hawaii, the island of Kauai. Okay, let me open my WOVA so I can read the bio for Mr. John Harder. So John Harder was hired by the County of Kauai to start up their solid waste management program in 1991, and was selected by the Hawaii State Department of Health to head the newly established Office of Solid Waste Management. He became a leader in promoting recycling and composting projects statewide while bringing the state's regulatory program into compliance with EPA requirements. He helped found Zero Waste Kauai, a local nonprofit advocating sustainable solid waste management practices. Welcome, John, and looking forward to hearing from you.
Okay, thanks so much. A couple things that didn't get into my little bio there. They cut it even more than I cut it. After working for the state for about 8 or 10 years in the 90s, I came out to Saipan, just up the road here, and helped them clean up the Puerto Rico dump. I guess some of you people from Guam can remember that. And build a new landfill and start a recycling program. It was one of the more exciting things that I've done. And then after that, I went back to Maui County and ran their solid waste program for a while, before starting up Zero Waste Kauai. The program kind of looks like I was supposed to talk about zero waste in Hawaii. Well, I'm not going to talk about zero waste in Hawaii because Hawaii's really not doing too much in the way of zero waste. We of Zero Waste Kauai have done a few things on our island. Back in the, about 2010, 2011, we passed a zero waste resolution through our county council, which targeted 70% waste diversion by 2023. I don't think we're going to get there, but we're doing pretty well. And we also passed a plastic bag ban. We've worked on a number of events. We handle public events, some running 2,500, 3,000 people. We do the county fair, which actually has about 40,000 people that run through it over 4 days. And we hit 75 to 80% waste reduction in those events. But as far as official government actions, either our county level or at the state level, Hawaii's kind of lax in that area. Okay, this is a little reminiscent from my Saipan days. Got this bumper sticker made from a friend, and I think it was the first one that I've seen like that from in Chamorro. Okay, yeah, what I want to talk about today is a little bit more about consumption and climate change. Touching on what Matt talked about there at the end, looking at some of the impacts that consumption and our generation of waste have on climate change and what we can do about that. Things are going to get complicated for me here. Okay, in assessing the impacts of human activity on global warming, it's become obvious that unrestricted growth and consumerism is a major factor in the growing impacts of climate change. Across the country and internationally, more and more environmental organizations are recognizing that adopting a zero waste management strategy is one way local communities can impact what is often seen as a problem requiring national and international effort. Oftentimes, communities fail to or are reluctant to take on climate change issues because they see them as too big. But these are some of the things you can do locally in implementing zero waste. So when you consider the wide range of carbon emissions generated by consumption, from extraction and harvesting to processing and manufacturing and transportation and marketing, and then finally the unnecessary disposal of unwanted, unusable, or unneeded products, it becomes obvious that our consumer-driven society is a major impact, a major cause of global warming. So EPA and numerous other environmental organizations have estimated that the greenhouse gas impacts of consumption can exceed 40% of all human activity. Yeah. Right. Okay. Okay. 29% of the U.S. greenhouse gas emissions result from the provision of goods produced within the United States. And like I said, that's from extraction, manufacturing, transportation, marketing, all of those things. We kind of put them in different sectors: the transportation sector, the mining sector, the air conditioning our supermarkets. But it's all stuff that's generated from our consumption. Provision of food contributes another 13% of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. And then on top of that, the traditional waste management generates as much as 5% of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. A lot of that being methane coming from our landfills. So local solutions to address climate change need to go beyond the simple reduce our carbon footprint responses. Responses like change our light bulbs, or get some solar panels, or buy a hybrid car. We need to radically modify our lifestyle, especially our addiction to more things. New high-tech gadgets, new toys, bigger and better stuff. Ever since the middle of the 1900s, our addiction to consumption perfectly tracks the steep rise in current carbon emissions. And you can see here, we always talk about the climate change curve is taking the little slope up. Well, consumption's done that same thing. And most importantly, we need to move away from the old concept of managing waste and adopt a strategy of sustainable materials management, a strategy that considers the impacts and solutions of our products from cradle to grave. As much as I'm an ardent advocate of diversion, zero waste management is not simply maximizing diversion through programs like recycling and composting. As Annie Leonard, the author of Story of Stuff, aptly stated, recycling is what we do when we're out of options to avoid, repair, or reuse the product first. In the waste management community, there's a new buzzword: sustainable materials management. The focus is changing from simply making sure all the stuff we buy is recycled to aggressively maximizing waste reduction. In that light, controlling consumption then becomes the centerpiece of the new paradigm. Across the country and around the globe, communities are adopting sustainable material management strategies as a way of improving local sustainability and helping to deal with the impacts of our excessive consumption of natural resources. By 2030, zero waste strategies can reduce greenhouse gas emissions by more than 400 million metric tons of CO2 per year, the equivalent of taking out more than 20% of the U.S. coal-fired power plants. This means that zero waste management offers a greater annual greenhouse gas savings than expanding nuclear power, significantly improving vehicle efficiencies, carbon capture projects, and many other prominent climate strategies. Okay, sustainable materials management is another term for zero waste, and its approach to using and reusing resources most efficiently and sustainably throughout their life cycle. As I mentioned earlier, studies have shown that consumption, the provision of food and consumer goods from extraction and cultivation and processing and manufacturing is responsible for over 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions. In addition to reducing emissions at the front end, recycling is still a great idea. You can see significant climate change from zero waste that come from the energy savings from recycling. So even though it's the option at the end of the pipe, after we've done everything else, using recycled materials to make new projects still requires less energy than making projects from virgin materials. And instead of using trees, oil, natural gas, and all those raw materials to make new products, when manufacturers use recycled products, they save 30 to 90% of the energy they would use to manufacture them from new and virgin feedstock. One key element in sustainable materials management is dealing with organics. primarily the growing volumes of food waste that end up in our landfill each day. As communities work to decrease greenhouse gas emissions, the first place to look is in the garbage can. We need to get the organics out. Nationwide, in many communities and some states even, there have been a determined effort that the quickest and cheapest way to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions is eliminating the landfill of organics. Every day, communities across the U.S. send tens of thousands of trucks to bury biodegradable materials such as paper products, food scraps, and yard trimmings in the landfills. And these materials amount to nearly half of our discarded resources. When buried in the landfill, those lettuce heads, grass clippings, and paper boxes don't just break down as they would in nature in a composting pile. They decompose anaerobically and generate methane. Intensive farming and short-sighted land use management has been spewing greenhouse gases into the atmosphere for more than 100 years. Poor agricultural practices contribute nearly 1/3 of the increase in atmospheric CO2 while stripping our soils of carbon and other essential nutrients. Rather than applying organic material to replenish the soil, modern industrial agriculture relies on huge quantities of petroleum-based fertilizers to produce crops on declining lands. You've heard that planting a tree can reduce your climate footprint because trees pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, but soil stores carbon too. Soils hold 2 to 3 times the carbon that the plants do. We're wasting the very carbon and nutrients our soils are desperately needed to sustain our society. Managing our organic society sustainably, first by reducing waste and then by supporting our reuse organizations like food banks and food pantries, and finally returning what we can't avoid to the soil is one of the quickest and cheapest ways to immediately reduce your community's greenhouse gas emissions. However, to make an even bigger impact, we all need to consider modifying our diet. I'll have to admit I'm not a vegetarian. I've resisted giving up meat for over 40 or 50 years. But recent studies that indicate that the production of livestock can generate as much as 50 times the greenhouse gas emissions as the cultivation of produce such as beans and grain are starting to convince me to at least significantly cut back on the amount of meat I consume. Okay, so if you're wondering what you can do locally to address the worldwide impacts of climate change, consider adopting a zero-waste lifestyle and support sustainable materials management. Here are a few lifestyle changes you can consider to help protect the planet. Buy local. Minimize shipping and packaging, and put your money back into the local economy. Reduce food waste. Ask for smaller portions at restaurants. Consider composting. Support your local food banks, and feed your chickens. Buy durable goods. For all us Hawaiians, we know what we're talking about, chickens. Buy durable goods. When shopping, consider how well made a product is and how long it will last. Reuse. Check out thrift stores. Look at repairing the things that break. Borrow and share what you don't need regularly. Buy recycle. Help close the loop in the sustainable material management effort. Reduce packaging. Buy in bulk. Bring your own shopping bags. Downsize. This is the major one. Consider buying smaller houses and smaller cars. Rethink your consumption. If you don't really need it, don't buy it. and transition to a plant-based diet. Probably one of the biggest changes you can make. So just as important as lifestyle changes is the necessity to work locally to change the system. Work with your local decision makers, your local governments. Look at local issues like smart growth, government purchasing, expanding public transportation, and banning single-use disposable plastic. There are definitely technical solutions that we need to pursue to help us undo the damage we've already caused our planet, but only through a major paradigm shift in our consumption habits can we guarantee a future for our children.
Thank you, John. It's great to hear from Scotland, from Hawaii, and now we're going to go to the islands of Palau. And I would like to welcome John in the back there. Nigare, I think that's how you say his last name, but he'll introduce himself to you. He's from the Solid Waste Management Office in Coro, the state of Coro in Palau. So welcome, John, and excited. We're all excited to hear from Palau and what you're doing there for the Zero Waste Initiative.
I gave our chairperson of the committee, Conchita, a hard time because I told her, I'm not going to do this. I'm tired of talking and doing the same thing for the past 15 years. And it's always the same result, same faces, same everything. That's the reality about solid waste. Too much talk. And then yesterday she was chasing me around and then you said, you're going to do this. So I said, I told her I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. He said, that's okay, just go do what you do best, just keep on talking. I'm known in my circle back in Palau that I talk a lot because I'm concerned. I came across a line that I read just recently, and it talks about attitude. And it says that a positive attitude gives positive results. An average attitude, average results. A poor attitude is poor results. I kind of like that, yeah. My line of work has always been about attitude. My position in my work, I work for the local government in Palau, or state government. I'm the project, solid waste management project coordinator and recycling advisor at the same time. I've been doing this for the last 16, 15 years. And the reality is, I have to tell you the truth, this is nothing new. I knew that if I came to attend this conference, it's going to be the same thing. It's the same thing. It's not like politics, it's the same time, we just turn it over around and around and around. But I got some good news to share with you. Just so that you know what my next assignment would be next year or this year. In 2017, a law was signed by our president, President Musa, that the distribution of plastic bag, it's called the Plastic Bag Reduction Act, that all distribution of shopping plastic bags will cease. Okay. In November 8, 2018, the cease of imported plastic shopping bag to Palau will stop. Okay, it's great news. And in August this year, 2019, the law will take effect. And so that's the first step towards the whole global zero waste effort. There's so many things that are happening around the world and in Palau at the same time regarding efforts to reduce waste and all this stuff. After my training in Suwana, about 2 years ago. Me and my colleague called the University of the National Government. I kind of realized something, that there's so much training and so much about everything, but there's something about these lessons that I learned that I need to implement. And it deals with people, you know. You talk about attitudes, I've always believed that islanders are the best people when it comes to recycling. I remember in the old days I used to complain to my grandparents because I was basically raised half of the way by my grandparents. If you cooked a fresh fish this evening, you'd have to cook it over. Eat it in the morning, and lunch, and evening, and the next day. That was the best way I could think about conservation and preservation of the environment. It's the same thing with tapioca and taro. You have to eat the food over and over until it's gone. So I don't know why food waste is such a waste when you have to eat it instead of throwing it away and recycling it. And so, you know, you have to eat it. Either you know what fits your stomach, so you get the right average instead of putting it on the shelf or throwing it to the pigs or something else. I don't understand. So it's always been a case in our home. It's coming here that I ate too much because I don't want food wasted on the plate. So I'm really full. You know? And so wherever we go and we raise up by our culture, we always have that part of your culture everywhere. That's part of you. That's something among the Chamorros in Saipan and in Guam, in Samoa, in everywhere, you know. People, you know, that's why we're big people, because no food should be wasted. That's just our culture in the North and South Pacific, you know. And so food is nothing. But everything else that we talk about in Palau, it's plastics and all this kind of stuff. And in my experience in this line of work, local people, the community just feel that we have nothing to do with this. This is all of your stuff, meaning the leaders. This is all about your stuff, nothing to do with us. And that's really true. Here's an example. Right now, I'm involved in what you call Urban Growers Program. It's basically about compost, and we started it out about 2 years ago. We wanted to come up with something because every time we do these educational programs, this is really, and I'm so glad I don't have to do the presentation because you know everything already from the other side of the world to everywhere. I think this is probably the same thing we're talking about. You know, I said, man, I've seen this. I've seen it in the internet. I've seen it in the last conference. They talk about it in the Micronesian Island Forum. You know, it's the same thing. And so I'm glad I never made a presentation. I just want to kind of share with you about my experience, about what we're doing, about being raised as a Palauan, what my culture about conservation and preservation, and what people want to do, something that they know. So we started a survey. Okay, we're going to start an organic project using, planting vegetables, just using organic materials, you know. Seaweeds, tahan-tahan, is that what they call it in Chamorro? Yeah, and grass clipping, but just not anything. We found out that never use a coconut leaf to make compost. It's the worst stuff. A lot of insects in it, no matter what. It's the worst thing. You know? I didn't went to school for that. I just learned that from home. You know? And so we did that. So we have, by going through SWAN and the whole certification stuff, then you take a little bit of this information, because not everything you learn outside is applicable in our culture. Took a little bit of that, and we started this project, and we worked with other people in the community out of the survey, said, we want this. We want this because we know what it's all about. But at the same time, they're so tired of all these same things that we keep on educating, conducting public hearings, because plastics, and you have to separate this and this and this, you know, they're fed up with that for the past how many years. They want something, an incentive. So that's what we did. So let's start with table gardens. So we conducted a survey at the landfill. We found out that one day, green waste is disposed at the landfill at about an average about 3 tons per day. That's pretty small compared to Scotland, you know, other places. We found out in 1 week there's close to like 5 tons of disposed lumber. So say, fine. there's not much money. People are always thinking, no money, no progress. I said, no. Palauans always be good about using old stuff. So, based on the survey, we collected all of the green waste, not the coconut leaves, all the lumbers, chop them up, improve them, maintain gardens, made piles of organic materials, and we started the whole project. We have about over 400 participants, not participants, 400 households. But basically, considering all of the health issues that are happening in my community, the hospital is going on, too much NCDs, people are getting sick, high blood pressure, and all that stuff. I said, this goes with health. People are going to eat organic vegetables. Second thing is, our culture, we love to share. Let's share with everybody. People are complaining, there's not enough money. We need raise. Okay, let's do this. The third step is, the third component is, if you're good enough, you can sell it, you can make extra money. So you talk about self-reliance. It's a good project. Not only about reduction of waste, our zero waste effort, but you're trying to help the community as well. So it's working. And so when you talk about zero waste, you know, as a Palauan, as somebody who's involved in waste management, and somebody, I think the most important thing is know your people. You know who they are, what their needs are. We discussed this in our meeting, and that's basically what's really important. What do we need as a group of people here today? And so that's basically my presentation, you know, is let's find out, you know, you probably don't have a culture as the way Palauans are back in Scotland, I don't know. You know, but I can tell you, if I go to Samoa, I can do the same project, they'll take it. Because I've been to Samoa, there's a very close similarity in our culture and tradition. I'll probably do it in Guam, they'll probably do it, understand it. And so around the region, there's that basic understanding among ourselves that this can be done elsewhere, you know. And so I just want to share that with you and say, you know, whatever happens in Palau, if it's good for you, it probably works. You know, because it's all about people. And so once again, it's about attitude. I can learn so much about here, but if I don't have the right attitude, and it's always, my mind is always somewhere else, and it's not about the people, nothing's gonna work, you know. And I want to thank you very much.
Thank you, John, for that presentation from the heart. All right, it's time for questions, comments, concerns. If you have any complaints, if you're angry about something, you know, this is the time to share. The audience is very important, and this is your time to share with us what you have, what concerns or questions that you may have for our panelists.
Got one for Matt Pryor there. The
Matt?
Innovation Centers. That was a really cool idea.
Can you speak up a little louder?
Those innovation centers, they were in Matt Pryor's presentation. Matt said they were connected to universities. How does the funding work for those?
So they're funded, they've got central funding through government. I don't know the exact value of it. Again, it's publicly available. But then what then happens is that the research institution's putting in time into the program. I think what then happens is where they get an example, like an opportunity comes out of it, then that spins off as a separate entity. So where you've seen examples of projects turning into businesses, that then becomes independent from the program. But then it's good evidence of the collaboration working. So it's good for all parties.
So not direct funding from industry at the beginning, but leads to industry eventually.
Yes, yeah. I think they're not getting funded directly from industry in the first instance. But once there's those opportunities coming in, then the businesses are putting putting time and money into developing those solutions with them.
My name is Petuna Loka with Kuwami PA. So maybe my question is to you.
Yeah, okay.
So how do you reach folks in Scotland, considering population diversity, cultural, language? I can understand about John being from the island. And we know how to communicate, but a big place like Scotland, how do you reach them, considering language, culture, and other challenges that you might have?
Yeah, that's a good question, and there was some really interesting observations from John. How does it work? Well, there's I guess at a very kind of practical level, there's quite a lot of census information about the population in Scotland. So there's an understanding of different communities, different groups that have maybe moved into Scotland from around the world, has led to a lot of communications being made available in different languages. I think I just thinking about what John was saying and how the sort of communities reach out. I think one of the things that I've noticed, and that's maybe, I think the roots of it are the same. You know, people work with people, people do projects together with people. Some of the big cities in particular, I think people can become quite isolated, have become quite isolated. And I think some of those initiatives that are happening within communities, there's a zero waste project happening, but it's actually happening because people feel good when they're actually doing something together and they're actually meeting other people and cooperating on something collectively. And there's a lot of challenges around well-being and happiness in some of the big diverse communities, and those initiatives are helping to address that. So I think there's a movement towards that that is probably around that need within people, as well as wanting to do something that's environmentally and sustainable for the planet. Does that answer your question?
Do you have a big cultural or language diversity in Scotland?
Yes, there is. There are. So Scotland itself has two languages. There's Scots, which is a dialect of English. It's a fabulous dialect, very rich tradition. There's also Gaelic. Gaelic is spoken more in the Highlands and Islands, but in reflection of that, it's one of the national languages of Scotland. So there's dual publication of everything with those two languages. The other languages that come out are probably to do with the migration of people over time into Scotland. And I guess more recently, there's been an upswell in the last 10 years of refugees and people fleeing distressing situations. I know through my partner works teaching English with refugees. There's an awful lot of charities and programs being delivered by local authorities to make information available to help them to understand society and culture in Scotland.
Sir, I have a question. Drew Hofschneider, member of the Senate in the CNMI. I'm actually from Tinian. And I do have with me also the mayor of the island, Mayor of Tinian, and some of the key employees. But as I was looking at your presentation earlier, you showed us a cinder block or some blocks. I just wanted to ask, I missed the presentation as far as what are the components of those?
So that would have been the brick. Yeah, that's
Yeah, that's the more a clay block than a cinder block.
Well,
oh.
I'm assuming that those are recyclables that you put
Yeah.
together.
So that block is over 90% of the material in that block is construction and demolition waste that has been crushed and graded and put to a specification and then put into some compression molds to produce that brick, that block. And it's not fired the way a kind of traditional brick is fired, and that's where there's a kind of significant saving on the embodied energy in producing the brick. So
You
it's
can use
got,
that for structures or?
well, yeah, that's the intention. Yeah, I mean it's a new product. They've been working, they've been researching. It's a spin-off business from a university. They've been developing that for a number of years. A lot of the effort has gone into the kind of testing to demonstrate that it's got the properties that will meet the building code in the United Kingdom, so that they can then use it. But they've done that. They've done that, and it should be. They're looking to go commercial with it this year.
Yeah, just a few years back, I was in the Philippines, and they are addressing the same issue with plastic.
Okay.
They've actually graded and shredded plastics together, and they mix them with, the sand and the cement, and they made some hollow blocks, of which they are much lighter, but they're also can withstand certain PSI.
Yeah. Okay.
I am not sure. I'm not an engineer, but
Yeah.
I'm not sure if it meets the minimum standard that's required, the building safety code in the U.S. standard.
Yeah.
But I do know that at the time when we saw it, they use it for just simple barriers and walls, some residential houses. But again, that was like 10, 15 years ago. So I'm just thinking, being an island nation, we always have to, for over the past 10, 15 years, we revolutionized the use of bottled water in the CNMI. I'm sure Guam is doing the same thing. It's very convenient to grab and go. As a matter of fact, I do it at home. But the next question is bring them in. Getting them out can be challenging.
Yeah.
So you guys are the professionals. You guys gone through the studies and all that. Do you suggest for us, island nation, that we implement a device where instead of sending them out, incorporate them into that, to the similar concept as to that 15 years ago that we saw in the Philippines?
Wow, that's a good question. But it's certainly an option. I think there's a. So what I've seen in Scotland is both looking to produce construction materials with the plastics, but also there's also been a lot of work trying to sort of push avoidance of single-use plastics. So it sounds a bit bizarre. I mean, Scotland's a very rainy country. Water is not a natural resource that it lacks, but they've been rolling out bottled water stations in railway stations and public places, and sort of trying to build up a network to avoid the single-use plastics. You've got clean, drinkable, potable water. That might be another initiative that's of interest for island nations, where you've got the clean water. It's not the infrastructure to put that in place could be an alternative, but certainly another where those plastics do occur, then construction product could be a solution to that if it can meet the right standards.
Well, thank you.
No, pleasure.
And just for full disclosure, the gentleman that we got this from, that we met, is actually German. So
Right.
he lives in the Philippines. So
Right, okay.
So he was,
Is it a product? Is it? I'd be interested to know.
Unfortunately, I haven't been in contact with him for a number of years now, but that's kind of like the trend that we were exploring, but
Yeah.
then we ran into the issue with compliance as far
Yeah.
as being
Yeah.
a U.S. territory
Yeah.
versus a foreign application. So we probably should have engaged further. That was 10 years ago, maybe. And just to date, I mean, a lot of things have changed over the years. So I'm just thinking today. Now I recognize John. John used to be was with the DPW way back when he was in Saipan as well. So, but yeah.
One of the things, actually, so on that point, one of the things the Zero Waste Scotland programme has funded has been support for businesses that have maybe a new idea that they're looking to produce a new product, but they're a small start-up business. They've got, that maybe needs some investment to support them. So there's funding programs in place, maybe not dissimilar to the recycling fund that I think Guam's set up or is considering, whereby there's a route to give. So if you had something around building standards, for instance, there's instances of these companies who they've got the product and they've been trying it out, but they lack the funds to maybe go through the formal standard testing, so that they could meet the building code, and that's been available to help them do that. And that's one of the ways that the programs have worked to do that. So that might be, if there's a funding route like that could be a way to help accelerate those things so that it overcomes that barrier, because it's a recognise that's a barrier for new products trying to meet those standards.
Thank you.
That's okay. Pleasure.
David?
Yeah, David Eisenberg, Development Center for Appropriate Technology in Arizona. One of the things, thinking about using plastic and developing sort of industrial things to deal with all the single-use plastics, reminded me of various efforts to incorporate fly ash from coal-fired power plants into, replacements for Portland cement, etc. And one of the issues is creating a new dependence on something we're trying to phase out, like burning coal, or creating these single-use plastics. So, when you step back, you look and you say, okay, well, so this might be a temporary thing that you do with something you have, but building a whole industry around using something you're trying to stop generating, doesn't make long-term sense. The other thing is, I don't know how accessible any of these things are from the islands, but the national laboratories have these SBIR grants, they're Small Business Innovation Research grants, that support, basically enable people with a proprietary product, material, system to essentially get grant funding to work in partnership with the national laboratories to do R&D, research and development work. One of the frustrating things about that program is that if you're a nonprofit organization with a public domain technology, there is no similar grant system in the national lab. These are publicly funded laboratories that don't support public benefit organizations with public domain technologies in the same way they support the private sector. But still, for a lot of those things, sometimes you can get different phases of funding to develop some of those ideas.
I just had a follow-on question. In terms of the business development and developing the new ideas, because the crux of that is everybody says, well, it's just uneconomic to use this alternative product. So the products that Scotland has supported and helped to get off the ground, have they found that they can actually successfully enter the market and that they are competitive with other products on the market? And then the second part to that, how imperative is the support to sort of basically enable them to get to the market? And third, how big does that support package as a jurisdiction have to be? because I have to be quite large. One was, are the products, are they finding they can actually compete in the marketplace?
So if you took, so a good example there would be, so like the Retech company, that they repurpose the IT equipment and mobile phone technology. That's a profitable, commercially viable business that's working well. They were supported, they had some initial support through Zero Waste Scotland, but that's now standalone. And I guess, it may have changed in the last year, but I certainly remember having a discussion about, so with mobile phone technology, there's a very, Apple doing, at the time when we were talking about this about 12 months ago, in the UK, they don't run any kind of repair and refurbishment service. I think my understanding was because it wasn't part of their business model to do that. But that's, I guess, it's an opportunity there for businesses to look at, taking the materials, because there's huge turnover of that as an example. So yes, there are, there's quite a few instances that have been successful. The second question was, do they need support? In certain cases, yeah. There's two avenues that can take, and so there's a number of different funding mechanisms. Sometimes it's support of technical input and advice that they need, and so they've set up mechanisms to do that, so that the company can get access to free support. It might be a technical issue, it might be financial, it might be commercial, legal, but that's been quite important so that they can pick those elements. But the other element is actual, is capital investment. So there's a number of funds that have been set up, both in the Zero Waste Programme, but also around the circular economy, where you can apply for it. And there's an application process. It's not you're not going to get money handed out, but every single application gets scrutinised robustly and considered, and they've been investing money in projects all across Scotland. As to the size of it, so the Circular Economy Investment Fund's pretty substantial fund. I think the initial fund was at there was a pot of £18 million in there, pounds sterling. But then perhaps, is that enough? Probably not. Given the size of Scotland's economy, there's probably more that's needed there. But that might be proportional to the size. I guess Scotland's population is around 8 million in total. So you've got a kind of population of demand of about 8 million people there. Maybe it's something that could be proportional to the scale of population that you're looking at.
All right, thank you, Matt.
Thanks, everyone.
From 2:45 till about 3:30, we'll be talking about the living buildings and how they must work around and through over the building codes. And the second one is planning for resilience. And we'll do that until about 4 o'clock. And then if you're all okay with that, we'll do some question and answer. Okay, so we're honored to have Vice Speaker Talina Cruz Nelson here with us today. And I'm going to start with her bio. Senator Nelson graduated from the University of Guam with a Bachelor of Arts degree in anthropology. She is a captain in the Guam Army National Guard and has earned several distinguished awards and honors. She is a former educator with the Guam Department of Education and is involved in civic and nonprofit organizations such as Sophomores International of Guam as the Vice President and the Guam Lions Harmony Organization. Welcome, Vice Speaker. We also here today are honored to have Timothy Hood from US EPA Region 9. Timony is a zero waste and green building coordinator for the US EPA's Pacific Southwest office in San Francisco. She started her career as a hands-on recycling manager driving a forklift. I would have loved to have seen that. And collecting, sorting, and baling recyclables. She has worked extensively with communities and government agencies to implement zero waste programs, advancing waste reduction, reuse, recycling, composting, green purchasing, and measurement. Since 2011, she has worked with the Guam EPA on the recycling measurement and zero waste initiatives, and I have to say I've had the honor of working with Timony since 2011, and it's been amazing working with her. We also have Mr. David Eisenberg, who is the Executive Director and co-founder of the Development Center for Appropriate Technology. David Eisenberg co-founded and has led DCAT since 1992. He served on the U.S. Green Building Council Board of Directors and founded and chaired the U.S. Green Building Council's Code Committee. David and DCAT received the International Code Council's 2007 Affiliate of the Year Award and 2007 U.S. Green Building Council Leadership Award. Recent work includes helping EPA develop their Tribal Green Building Code Development website and toolkit, helping development the International Residential Code Tiny House Appendix Q, Light Straw Clay Construction Appendix R, and Straw Bale Construction Appendix S. David was lead author and investigator for an EPA report on resilience strategies to minimize building-related disaster debris. So please join me in giving our speakers and Vice Speaker a hand and welcome them. I will turn over to Timony.
Thank you, Julie. It's been great working with Julie as well. And I also want to thank Senator Talina Cruz Nelson for being here and honoring us today with her presence, as well as all the bright zero waste stars I see in the audience out there. I know I've met many of you over the years and some of you at the Zero Waste Pacific Conference, and I'm just so inspired by the great work that you're doing. And it's been fabulous. It's been a highlight of my career working with folks from the Pacific Islands and really learning from you and from the folks doing the hard work out there on the islands to reduce waste and just handle very difficult situations. So I'm starting with something you don't see very often here, kind of a wood-framed building. But this building is an example of a building designed for deconstruction. So designed very thoughtfully on the front end so every piece could be taken apart and reused. And it was the winner of a competition that I developed with a team of folks called the EPA Life Cycle Building Challenge. And still on the web, we have examples of this type of building thinking. So just to kind of ground our day, I'm going to go really quickly, give you a broad overview, and then David has an incredible wealth of codes expertise to share, and he's going to cover things in more detail. But EPA sets out priorities for our Sustainable Materials Management Program, and I wanted to share that being here on this session about the built environment is an excellent place to be because it's one of our top priorities. And when we talk about the built environment, that doesn't just include the horizontal built environment, but also our roads and bridges and infrastructure. Other top priorities are food and packaging, which you'll also be hearing a lot about at this conference. And another way we think about prioritizing is how do we actually manage and work with our materials? And we spend a lot of time at these events talking about recycling and composting, and that's something I love talking about too. But source reduction, meaning reducing waste on the front end, and reuse are at the very top. And that doesn't matter if you're talking about packaging or building materials, anything you're talking about, that should be the place we're spending even more time talking about, and I'm going to talk about that some. And it's also covered in Guam's Zero Waste Plan. If you haven't seen that, there are 2 volumes, and there are some very specifically related to construction and demolition, debris, building materials reuse, etc. So just to kind of take a step back though, why do we want to work on buildings? Why should this be a priority? And I think the number one reason is the environment It's our buildings, right? We spend about 90% of our time indoors, and it's said that oftentimes the air quality inside of our buildings is worse than standing in the middle of the freeway in Los Angeles, breathing in all that exhaust fumes. So that's pretty disturbing, and much of it's related to things like mold, but it can also be related to radon, which is an invisible gas that comes up through our floor systems in our homes and is the #1 cause of lung cancer among non-smokers in the US. Did anybody realize that? I just love to see a show of hands. How many people knew that radon was the #1 cause of lung cancer in the US behind smoking? Very few. Well, I'm glad you know now. And 21,000 deaths a year. Huge number, right? Unnecessary deaths by lung cancer caused by radon. And radon's a big problem in Guam. Just to go back, why is this relevant? Radon is a huge problem in Guam, and there are radon-resistant building techniques that can be put into place very cost-effectively up front when you're doing construction that can avoid that risk. The other reason we want to work on buildings is because we want to think about the environmental impacts. And when we look at the environmental impacts of buildings, it's a huge portion of the materials generated in the US. So about 2/3, it's 558 million tons a year of building materials in the US are generated versus what we consider municipal solid waste, which is everything we generate in our offices and homes. That's at about 258 million tons a year. So of course it makes sense that concrete's really heavy, right? Plastics aren't, concrete's really heavy. But I think a lot of times when we talk about materials management or waste management at these conferences, we're focused in on recycling and kind of what's happening in people's homes. But we've got to take time to step back and think about our built environment too. And then of course, building codes and building work goes way beyond just materials. 40% of all the energy use, a lot of the water as well used, and CO2 emissions. There's another building that's really focused in on source reduction. It's in Monterey, California area, Seaside, California, a former military base, and they took apart a lot of the old military buildings and reused some of the lumber. And they made it so that you could really get a lot of daylight into the building, and that's shown to improve test scores. Here's the inside of the building. Another principle of designing things to reduce waste so you can easily upgrade or change out systems when you need to is not to cover everything up with these kind of ceilings in here, but to have everything exposed. It looks kind of industrial, but it makes it so you can access and readjust the wiring without having to rip out and throw things away. It really gives people easy access for repairs. And then down here we have what's called a cistern, collecting water off the roof, and then the kids do activities in the water that's running out of that cistern. And the beautiful thing about this school is that they have everything tied into a computer system. It's a net zero energy building, so they're constantly monitoring the water use and also the renewable energy generation. And then you do activities like your math class today. You're going to see how efficient has our solar been over the past 2 months, and what were the peaks? Make a graph. You know, so they really tie it into the children's education. So that's a real cool green building example. Another thing they did that certainly could apply on interiors here potentially is they came up with ideas for nail-free paneling, because a lot of times you take apart wood and it takes so much time and energy to pull out the nails, and then the wood's kind of damaged. So this is my favorite up here. It's just strips with adhesive, and then you pour an antidote down on it when you're ready to take apart the building, and it just falls apart. Kind of cool. This one down here is what they ended up using, which is channels. So you could just drop the wood in and not have to use any nails. Very efficient for putting up a building. Here's another cool building that's on a pin foundation, so they didn't have to have concrete down there. They can move this building, so they kind of snip it apart of the seams. It's out in the Seattle area, and then you just move piece by piece. So they've taken this, they called it a pavilion, and they moved different pieces to different sites and reassembled it as a building. It's this idea, again, you don't have to smash down a building and start new. You can clip it apart and reuse it. So here's some principles about reducing waste related to buildings, and I kind of highlighted ones that I thought were really especially relevant here. And one is, the first thing is think about the materials in your buildings and in the building products you're bringing in. Can they be safely reused and recycled? And there's a lot of research going on with kind of identifying potential toxics in our paints and our adhesives, and how can we get those out of our buildings. And then another one is make the things that tie the building together accessible. So using kind of open, kind of standardized modular systems, using screws and bolts that people can see how to take apart. So you're not having to like rip apart, glue together things that are so difficult and everything gets ruined. So initially when Conchita invited me, she was so eager to have this exciting new policy that's come out of Portland, Oregon shared. And it's a mandatory deconstruction ordinance, which they put in place for all buildings that were older from 1916 and prior that had that beautiful old growth lumber in them. And so I have on here a link to a YouTube webinar given by Sean Wood, who's the manager of this program. It's been incredibly successful at reducing waste in Portland and has become a model for other communities all over the country and the world. So they did, much like we just heard from the last session, a big training effort where they trained people that were difficult to employ in some cases. They're coming back into the workforce. They trained people on deconstruction and safe deconstruction because there are hazards such as asbestos and lead-based paint that need to be managed. And we also want people to be able to deconstruct safely and efficiently. Because of that, 17 new small companies started up. So talk about a job creation engine and also an onboard for people into the construction industry. Because if you can take a building apart, then you can learn to put one up too. So it's a really great, great program. And the results have been of all those old homes, which is hundreds that they've taken apart, 75% of all the materials in those buildings have been salvaged rather than thrown away. And much of that is wood, but certainly not all of it. So the light fixtures, a lot of the appliances, that's being salvaged too. If you ever get a chance to go to Portland, and I was able to not too long ago, it's just covered with reclaimed wood. It's beautiful, and it's all over the place. And now I'd like to shift gears and talking about something that I know is very near and dear to folks living on the islands, and that's this report that David worked on with the EPA, and it's still in draft, so we'd like to ask for your input. And it is about how do you design buildings up front to reduce disaster debris. And that means really reducing the risk to the inhabitants of those buildings as well. So I'm not just talking like we're so concerned about the waste. We're concerned about the people in those buildings and making sure that they're safe. And a really neat study that was funded by the federal government, by FEMA, done by the National Institute of Building Sciences, found the best investments you can make in terms of disasters related to the disasters that you're really facing out here, hurricane surge and wind. So for every dollar spent, federally funded, to try and kind of build up the buildings to resist those problems, $5 in return. And I love this next column even more. We go beyond the building code requirements and you invest in doing that to make the buildings very disaster resistant, a 7x return on those investments and 5x for the wind reduction. So really big returns, even bigger than you would get for worrying about earthquakes on those investments. And this is a piece from our report, the draft report, showing first the terrible impacts of the disaster in American Samoa quite a few years back in their village. And then down here, I think something that often comes to mind is like, oh gosh, how much is this going to cost us, right? Because we don't have much money. But the simple idea that all the external doors should open outwards rather than inwards, so that when the typhoons come, you don't have the whole building collapsing because of the air pressure coming in. So that's an example of some of the ideas in here. Many of you may know Norwood Scott, who was out with EPA doing the recovery work right after Super Typhoon U2. And he worked with us to talk about some of the things that were specific examples of things that should be done. And let's just cover a few. One is replace the treated wood utility poles with storm-resistant power poles made of concrete or composite. I see that's been done in Guam. I was driving around yesterday, and it's covered with concrete poles. So you already thought of that. But it was a huge problem there because when the poles went down, they didn't have many stored up. And so they weren't able to bring the power back online for quite some time because they just didn't have power poles to put back up. Another idea is in the power plant, raising the utilities off the floor and making sure you do everything you can to have the roofs be very strong and to install extra floor drains. So those are some ideas that we just wanted to share, and we'd love to add more from your experience. So whatever island or country you're from, if you've got experience you'd like to share with us, to share with others. This is an EPA draft report, as I mentioned, and we'd be glad to get your input. Something else I just wanted to touch on because it's very exciting and innovative is biomimicry, really looking to nature to inform our building practices. And so the first story is there was this huge storm, hurricane I believe it was, and they looked around and the whole town was devastated. But there was a grove of trees, and that one particular grove of trees stood, and none of the others did. So people are like, what's going on with these trees? They're special. Well, it turns out the trees were intertwined underground, right? The root systems, and that supported them to stay standing through that huge storm. And that's the same thing that potentially innovative people working on building foundations could look at. Like, how could we tie our buildings together underground so when the huge storms come, they don't, completely leave us? And here's another idea from Florida with a rounded home, much like a shell, that's going to be more resistant. There's no roof flying off here, right? There's no roof to fly off. So just another idea from a dome house. I also wanted to share a very exciting story out of Haiti. Dr. Ryan Shelby is a colleague who worked with us on tribal green building and how to work with the tribe to bring in their ideas for housing in Northern California at the Pinoleville Pomo Nation. And they wanted big rounded kitchens and they wanted extra ventilation because they do community cooking, which worked out really well. So he built these homes and they were very green. They had indoor and outdoor air quality monitoring because they have a lot of straw fields nearby and air pollution. And they also have all solar energy really strong there. Well, he said, what you gotta do when we're designing buildings in a community is listen to the local people. Listen to them, learn about what they want. So down here is the building on the Pinoleville Nation, but he's been working in Haiti where they had a terrible hurricane, and he came up with some other engineers with a clamp-on roof system that's super resilient and can be attached to their traditional structures. So rather than mowing everything down and starting fresh, they wanted to use something that would be appropriate for the buildings in Haiti. And I met with the executive director from Habitat for Humanity yesterday, and she said, oh, they've been telling us here about that roof system and how we might want to use it in Guam because it was so effective in Haiti. So, small world, isn't it? He's a finalist for a big national award for the best public servant in all of the federal government for that work. And now I'd like to close out with some quick concrete actions. What are some things that folks might do? And from Guam's Zero Waste Plan, there's a greening roadways area. It's about grinding up building materials that could be used for base material. Sometimes if you're new to construction, you're like, what's that, base material? Well, that's just the stuff you put under a building or road to make sure it's really stable so that the ground is all about the same stability so it won't shift and settle over time. So there's all different sizes, so they call it like 2 inch minus, 2 inches or less, 1 inch minus, and these are some examples of some recycled concrete aggregate. Here's a crushing plant right here in Guam, Hawaiian Rock Products of Guam, and they have down here is the crusher, and up at the top is the one that's going to sift through that, and so you kind of sorts it out. So what I would say is, concrete crushing is not something you go into lightly. These machines break down all the time and they're hard to maintain because they're smashing against the rebar and the concrete. But what a waste to throw that stuff away, right? When it can be the foundation you're paying for under your buildings. And then this is another idea I just wanted to share quickly, and I think for many islands this is already happening very much informally, the idea of sharing and a tool lending library. Well, you just go to your neighbor, right? But in Berkeley, they have it right in the public library. They have a tool lending library for folks where people can just go and check out a tool in addition to a book. So here's what it looks like. And as we were reading about these, it sounded like a really great idea because he said some places, they're like, we don't have tools, we don't have a budget. Just ask people to donate. So people donated a bunch of tools. And then another thing they mentioned is it can go beyond tools. It could be vacuum cleaners. It could be, any number of things. And another thing that comes up is like, do we really have the time, to staff up a tool lending library? Some places just open like a couple hours a week. 2 hours a week, you learn the tool for a week, and then come back next week. And some places are doing it by membership, some places by deposit. So there's a lot of different ways that this could be put into place, but I just wanted to share it because I think this idea that everyone needs their own, shears or whatever, it's just not the case. I met with the Guam Contractors Association yesterday with the president and asked him if they have anything similar to this in Guam, and he said, we got some small businesses that are renting tools at quite high prices. But as far as a free library, that's really not the case, and that probably could benefit a lot of folks. Here's another thing with those lent tools that can be done. I know pallets are a big issue on the islands, and we've talked about the value of composting and maybe backyard composting. You can make simple backyard composters with pallets. Very, very effective use of kind of a handy person's skills. Oops. And here's Glenn and Connie from Guam EPA. They came to visit us in El Cerrito, Northern California, to see a model transfer station. And a transfer station, kind of where you're dropping off all sorts of recyclables and things that you have at the front right here. They have a library where people bring their used books and they drop off old eyeglasses too to donate. And then down here at the very bottom, you may not be able to see it, but it's a trailer for reuse. So it's not just about recycling, it's also about reuse, but they take household hazardous waste, they take fluorescent light tubes, all types of batteries. They've really done it up right, and the kind of the cover there is all solar energy, and it's a LEED Platinum building that's their office building. So this was the first and kind of the greenest of all the transfer stations I've ever seen, probably the greenest one around. This is another example I just wanted to share about building materials reuse, which I know is going on very much in kind of small businesses and organizations on the islands. But this is a huge one at Berkeley, where they're actually going to where they dump the waste, and they have 3 people every day just pulling out reusable items. It sounds a dirty, tough job, right? It's not easy, but they pull out 3 tons a day of stuff that they're able then to give to a nonprofit and sell back out to community at reduced rates. And I think the thing I wanted to share with you is there's a real opportunity for building materials that are reusable. Like, you wouldn't want to sell a very inefficient toilet, let's say. You'd want to upgrade that to the water efficient toilets. But there's a lot of things like sinks, etc., that people can reuse, and they're doing that in large quantities here. Their biggest seller is doors, you know, where they just sell rows and rows of doors. And then these windows down here, they may not be the most energy efficient, but people like it for greenhouses or for art projects, so as long as people know what's appropriate, they can use that. And then lastly, I just wanted to share this concept of reuse centers on the Big Island of Hawaii, where they use actually bamboo structures that EPA helps support with a grant that could be collapsed down if there was a typhoon or a hurricane coming. And they have, some of these are staffed, and some of them have money coming and going for the products, but some of them are just open air. People can drop off stuff for reuse and take stuff away. And it's been incredibly successful at bringing people together, because I don't know about you, but people who love thrift stores, like me and Sabrina, you just love to connect with people that love to reuse and kind of craftify things. And they got so many volunteers from the community and the local college too to volunteer their time to help at the reuse centers, and then they go out to schools too and do a lot of projects related to reuse to really instill the activity in the community. So this is the building from the very front, the beautiful wood building being kind of taken over by nature. So I wanted to kind of close with that and say that we're just really excited to hear from you and work with you if there's anything we can help with. We'd love to be in touch. Thank you.
So while Timothy's getting my presentation up, first of all, I'm honored to be here and to have all of you here, and I also I want to thank Timothy, who I've known for probably 15 years, and we've done a number of different projects together, and it's been fabulous, actually. And I also want to say that this presentation is actually what it says about the Living Building Challenge. I have a little bit of information in here about the Living Building Challenge, but it's really it doesn't focus on that so much, in part because it's really hard to do Living Building Challenge projects anywhere, and it's even harder on islands where there's a whole set of imperatives, requirements in that system that would be really challenging. But I'll talk about a lot of those things as we go, and hopefully that won't be a problem. But if anyone's interested in knowing more about the Living Building Challenge or any of that, I'll be around. I'll be Saturday morning, so I'll be happy to answer questions. Also, I'm going to go through some of this stuff kind of quickly, and I wanted to mention that in the PDF file that will be available for this presentation, at the end of it, originally there was the potential that I was going to give 2 talks here, one a lunch talk, which was going to focus more on the Living Building Challenge parts of it. So at the end of the slides for this presentation is going to be sort of another presentation. And just so you know, the way I do my PowerPoint presentations to share is I turn them into notes. And so what you get on each page is the slide and then the commentary that goes with it. So it's not just the PowerPoint slides. And so there's a bunch of information that I would love to be able to share that there isn't time to share in this presentation. So if there are things that I kind of skip over, I want to leave time for questions at the end too. So, and there's way too much information. So, so this is my granddaughter Juliet, who is, this picture is about 3 years old. She's 8 years old now. This is my favorite quote of all time. Our greatest responsibility is to be good ancestors. Dr. Jonas Salk, who invented the polio vaccine, said that. And my version of that in the regulatory realm is where in our regulatory systems or decision-making processes is the continuous and explicit representation of the rights and welfare of our children's children. And frankly, it's really hard to find that. And I can't imagine a larger sort of failure of understanding of what our real responsibilities are for safeguarding the public. So a little bit about my checkered past. So the Development Center for Appropriate Technology I co-founded in 1992 because people are always saying, what's appropriate technology? So the sort of standard definition is it's the lowest tech or simplest technology you can use to do what you need to do well. But my favorite definition of it was given to me by John Turner, this British architect. He's the guy who also gave me that term INPERT, if you heard my comment earlier today. And he basically said that appropriate technology is technology that can be used basically for our own benefit and the benefit of our community that doesn't make us dependent on systems over which we have no control. And when you unpack that, it's certainly a lot about enhancing the local capacity to meet local needs, which I think is really important. And appropriateness has to do with the context, really, a whole spectrum of things. What you're trying to do, where you're doing it, what's available, who's involved, et cetera, all those things. So, yeah, my checkered past. So, so this building is a structural concrete house that I was the construction superintendent for in Tucson that used 1,400 cubic yards of concrete for 2 people to live in part of the year. It was for the guy, George Revachel, who invented Benadryl, the first antihistamine, actually. And then that's Biosphere 2 in Arizona, and I worked for 3 years building the cover, the space frame and glazing systems for the Biosphere. And then this is a rammed earth house that I was the construction manager for, also in Arizona. I was the co-author of the Strawvale House book in 1993, a book that sold 120,000 copies, some frightening number like that. I was the vice chair of the first ASTM, American Society for Testing Materials, the first ASTM subcommittee on sustainability for buildings for 5 years, and we developed the first standard guide for the design of earthen wall systems for adobe and rammed earth, things like that. The tiny house appendix. This was a report on code, regulatory and systemic barriers affecting living building projects, a 90-some page tome. Some other things I'll talk about. Anyway, I've been doing lots of crazy stuff for a long time. So this straw bale construction is what got me into codes and standards, a slippery slope, and because I was a builder, and building codes is like income tax or life insurance or something like that. Why would anybody do that? But what happened was I got involved with that, and I was teaching people how to build these buildings, and they were then not able to get building permits for them, and I sort of felt like we were seducing people into thinking they could do something that they couldn't do, and because I have an overdeveloped sense of responsibility from my parents, I thought, well, so somebody needs to do something about that. So we were doing testing, really low-tech testing for the city of Tucson and Pima County building departments so that we could get permits there. That turned into a building code. And I wrote this article on straw bale construction and building codes. And that instantly turned me into the straw bale codes guy, which then I went through what I call the why me phase for the next year or so. And eventually I realized that I was actually working in a really high leverage place. Like you could build individual buildings that were incredibly, sustainable or wonderful, but if you really wanted to have an impact, change the building codes a little bit, and the impact would be enormously larger than building the best possible individual buildings you could build. It took me a while to get there. So with straw bale, what happened was we did all these tests, structural, fire, seismic, and over many years, and a bunch of interim codes, and it took a mere 20 years from when I wrote that first article about the codes testing in the very first issue of the Last Straw Journal, to getting the straw bale appendix in the 2015 IRCs in just 20 short years. On the other hand, the light straw clay construction appendix sort of rode on the coattails, so they took about a year. We took 20, they took 1, because it happened at the same time. While I was working on the straw bale stuff, I started developing these relationships with code officials and the code organizations, and ultimately building trust with them. And we started getting invited to write feature articles in their magazines, actually, of the code organizations, which was kind of amazing. Eventually, they gave me a regular column. Anyway, all this stuff was going on. I got elected to the board of the U.S. Green Building Council, created the code committee, chaired it for the 9 years of its existence. But in 2007, I think, so this is the building codes for a small planet. This was my regular column. They invited me to have a column in their magazine. They named it to basically educate their membership, which was really amazing because it was an outside environmental, social activist advocate, not a code official. But the relationships we built basically resulted in that happening. So 2007 was amazing. So I spent years negotiating this agreement between the board of directors of the U.S. Green Building Council and the International Code Council, the National Organization of Building Officials. And in 2007, I got to sign the MOU between those two organizations. That same year, the International Code Council moved into a LEED Silver building. They moved their headquarters into a LEED Silver building in DC. And then we got the Affiliate of the Year award from the ICC and a leadership award from the U.S. Green Building Council. And it was really recognizing the same about 10 years of work trying to bring those organizations together to see their shared purpose. One of the things that was happening while I was working on all of those various things was that I started seeing that there was this problem. The more sustainable something was, the more likely it was that it would be almost impossible to get it through the permitting process for buildings. And I thought, what's going on here? Why are these really important improvements more challenging than like the most negative impact, materials and systems? And it's because basically nobody was paying attention to those other hazards, and these things looked risky. So lots of stuff was going on, and the more of this I did, the more I realized that that was a problem. So I also discovered that there were lots of ways you could go about getting things permitted. The less formal, well, if you're lucky enough to build where there isn't a code, or where you're far enough out in the woods or whatever where you're not going to get caught. Some people build, as we put it, without benefit of code. And then you take typically the individual project using the alternative materials and designs provisions that are in the codes. Oh, and you can, work on developing research and testing and stuff. You can develop local codes. And there's more formal stuff. Get an evaluation service report, like someone did for bamboo poles, actually, so that building officials would know how to treat them, how to deal with them, develop a local code, create a consensus ASTM standard like we did for earth and wall systems. And more urgent, I think, is to use disasters as an opportunity to push improvements through the system in a different way than is typical. And I know it's all urgent. I talk a lot about frames of reference because our frames of reference determine what it is we see and how we see it. So that nice little patch of green is actually in a junkyard. I call all this stuff detritus. We don't see the whole picture most of the time. Especially in the realm of things, of regulations, there are details and there's a big picture. What they teach architects is this habit of shifting your focus between the details and the big picture back and forth, so that what you're doing for a specific material or a room in a building or whatever, then you keep seeing it again and again as part of a whole structure that you're designing and not just a thing. That doesn't occur everywhere. So here's the purpose. This was from the 2012 IBC, International Building Code. The purpose of this code is to safeguard public health, safety, and welfare from hazards attributed to the built environment. That's the big picture purpose, and the rest are really important details. But it's really important to understand that the commitment is safeguarding public health, safety, and general welfare. It doesn't say only for these things, these details, and so a lot of stuff's left out. So codes do really well with the things that they're designed to affect. So they're really good at enabling us to build buildings that rarely fall down, burn down, trap people in emergencies, electrocute them, let them fall from high places, suffocate them too quickly, etc. And because of that, most people think we've dealt with the risks associated with buildings. But what we've really done is move them in space and time. We move them a lot of those risks away from the building site and out into all the natural systems that are our life support systems. And we move them from the present out into the future to our kids and our kids' kids and the future generations of all the other species on the planet on whose welfare, our welfare also depends. So one thing is, looking at buildings through codes is a lot like looking through a microscope. You can see really important things about materials and their characteristics and site conditions and all kinds of stuff, and these categories of hazard that need to be addressed. But if you take your eye away from that lens, you can see that there are a lot of other hazards attributable to the built environment that the codes don't address. And the assumption is that there's some other entity with authority and responsibility for addressing those things. And the reality is that often there isn't. And so the codes create these sort of gaps, and there are overlaps too, which create gaps. If you have two entities responsible for the same thing, it often makes it, the reality is often that means no one's actually responsible. Anyway, my whole point was, hey, this is not either or, that if we're really going to safeguard the public, we need to recognize all of these and balance those, the things that we do to address those hazards, by seeing them all in context and in relationship. And I was also getting involved in systems thinking, and I had some really interesting mentors in that realm. But I started thinking about it. We talked about the building regulatory system, and I was thinking, is this really a system? Because in reality, it's an aggregation of reactions to failures, basically, created, aggregated out of no particular design. Like, we didn't really sit down and design a comprehensive, integrated regulatory system for the built environment with system goals and system principles. No, we just have this thing that's evolved over the years in a not particularly organized way. So we have regulatory silos, we have all these nested levels of jurisdictional authority and responsibility, and the permitting process is often like a maze, and it's really hard sometimes to figure out how to get through it. So a big issue is we don't get regulations in advance of problems. They come, and regulatory entities come because we have problems. And so problems that are big and serious enough to demand an official response. So the rear view mirror, is the main navigational tool in the regulatory realm. Can be a problem. We don't like precautionary, regulations. We don't like things that are anticipating, emerging problems. It's hard enough to regulate the stuff we already have, right? The problems we already know about. And I did this. It actually changed it in Photoshop, so it says risks in mirror may appear smaller than they are. Another thing is that they're all minimum standards, which basically means that we create this arbitrary and intricate boundary between what's illegal and what's barely acceptable. That's the regulatory, realm. And one of the problems with a lot of innovative stuff is that new, stuff basically ends up being illegal or treated that way. No, it's not in the code, you can't do that. Or something you're concerned about looks risky to us, like because they're ignoring the gigantic risks. You can focus on the microscopic risks, and I have many stories about those kinds of things. Like a really good one is gray water. So there's this huge, in the public health realm, huge concern about human illness from gray water exposure, right? Well, my friends in California search the CDC database for the 13 waterborne illnesses that they've been tracking for the last 60 years. Guess how many documented cases of gray water, of human illness attributed to gray water there are in the millions of reports that basically have to be investigated. Gray water appears in 0 documented cases of those waterborne illnesses. That doesn't mean that people haven't gotten sick, but is it this gigantic public health menace? I think not. So when they changed the codes in California to upgrade the gray water law, what the governor wanted it, the state agency went back to the Uniform Plumbing Code appendix, was like going back 20 years to start this process, and it was very frustrating. And my friend Art Ludwig at Oasis Design called me up and he was telling me about their looking at the CDC database and all of this, and I said, well, we need to ask a different question. So other than drinking it or inhaling aerated, sprinklered gray water, what's the most dangerous thing you can do with it? And my answer was, force people to double the amount of black water by taking this relatively safe water and mixing it with black water, and then putting it in a failed or overloaded septic system or sewer system or a combined sewer and stormwater system, where you've dramatically increased the likelihood that that much more dangerous water is going to get in surface and groundwater. So you can't take this incremental, tiny, unmeasurable risk at the building site in exchange for a gigantic systemic risk reduction, because there's some increment of risk at the building. And that's how the whole system is sort of operating without paying attention, to the whole picture. And so anyway, Art Ludwig, the guy I was just talking about, came up with this. So he has noted that these hazards have resulted in deaths. So our building codes and regulations have made it so that, like fire departments, they spend most of their time, responding to health emergencies, people having heart attacks, or old people stepping off a curb and their hip breaks because they're of osteoporosis, or what, there's all this stuff, but they're not fighting structure fires as much as they're dealing with all this other stuff. So all of these things are going way down. And these new hazards from from pedestrian unfriendly cities and buildings, etc., and cancer and climate disruption, these things, any one of those things absolutely dwarfs the 19th century hazards that the codes are focused on. And yet those are things you're not allowed to talk about in code hearings when you're trying to change the building codes to deal with these things, because it's a different silo. 2 great quotes. English doesn't contain a suitable word for a system of problems, so I had to coin one. Therefore, I choose to call such a system a mess. The solution to a mess can seldom be obtained by independently solving each of the problems of which it is composed. Russell Acuff said that, a great systems thinker. And then Amory and Hunter Lovins and Paul Hawken in their book Natural Capitalism said, optimizing components of a system in isolation tends to pessimize the whole system. And that's what we do over and over again in these systems. We're looking at we're fixing something, we're not looking at how it affects everything else, and it leads to a lot of problems. So the Living Building Challenge is this incredibly demanding certification, and it's basically trying to get to net positive built projects over the whole spectrum of impacts that they have. And so you can see, this is, no, that was a mistake. Anyway, so this says code green, high performance, sustainable. So basically, you know, most of what we're doing with a lot of this stuff is trying to get to less bad buildings, less bad impacts. And what the Living Building Challenge is about is, let's see if we can get to net positive or better, you know, actually create projects that have benefits across the spectrum. And so it's for any kind of building type, and it's continually evolving. And the imperatives have to do with place, limits to growth. So there's a whole set of requirements: net positive water, net positive energy, health and happiness, a lot of stuff. Materials, there's a red list, there's embodied carbon footprint, responsible industry, net positive waste, human scale. So there's equity issues, and beauty and education are also criteria in it. So it's a hard standard to meet. So you can get, if you meet it, you can get a living building certification for the whole project. If you can only meet part of it, you can get certification for water or for internet. Zero energy is one. You know, you can get partial certifications for projects that go a long ways but don't quite meet the whole thing. Anyway, it's a really interesting thing. And there's the two rules are, all the imperatives are mandatory, except for some exceptions for things that are really market-based problems, for materials that there just aren't things that, you know, you can get to. And the project has to operate for a year before it can apply for certification. So basically, it's really performance-based. You know, you need to prove that all these things you're claiming are actually real. One of the things that came out of it, which I think is valuable to share, so there was a project that actually never got built in the city of Portland. They had a real challenge with the net zero water requirements. And one of the things that the architects did was they came up with a flow chart. This was an approval barrier, sort of regulatory barrier map that showed where all the things, like doing these incredibly positive things, were against all these different laws and regulations and policies. So these are all places, you know, where they required appeals or, you know, some special exemptions from, you know, from having to meet the policies that are supposed to be protecting us. But like the best imaginable project, you know, basically was almost impossible to permit. And then one of the things that the Living Building Challenge, the Living Future Institute created, there's actually guidance now for creating these maps in your own jurisdiction. They're looking at water, but you could create it for anything you're trying to do that help you actually identify the places where the regulations or policies are barriers to achieving the goals that you want. And one of the things that's really powerful about having something like this, they took this map to the state legislature and they changed the gray water and water harvesting and other laws in the state of Oregon based on this information. And so the state legislature went, wow, we should fix that. And they did, which is really cool. And that's what I encourage people to take projects, you know, and do that kind of, you know, actually go beyond just that project and see what else can come from it. This is a report we did on this that I mentioned earlier. It's available. A couple of years ago, I got asked to do a commentary for this our Building Research and Information Journal on a feature issue that they put out on climate change and building governance, on regulation and policies. Mine was called Transforming Building Regulatory Systems to Address Climate Change. I just found out that they published it as a book, actually. But anyway, it wraps up a lot of the a lot of the problematic patterns that are in the regulatory realm and have some suggestions about what to do about them. So where are we time-wise, do you know?
So we have about another 10 minutes for the talk, and then we're going to go to question and answer.
Good, thank you. So people talk about thinking outside the box. I always think, well, that's actually just a set of concentric boxes. Like something happens, you get out of the box you're in into the next bigger box. And I like that. I created this image in Photoshop. It just reminds me that, you know, when you think your paradigm is like big enough, it's not. You know, and that they're just fractions of reality, and there's much more to know. So, you know, I like to think about maybe we could change some of this stuff. Like, what if codes were actually based on a set of principles for what buildings should and shouldn't do? Like, the should part's really important. What if we were actually also thinking about not just preventing the worst stuff, but actually enabling the built environment to do what we want it to do, not just prevent it from doing the rest. A good first principle would be a kind of Hippocratic oath corollary that buildings should first do no harm. Obviously, you have to look at the whole life cycle of buildings to get there. Another thing that's really important now is that when things, so one of the ways we determine what's safe in the codes is by narrowing which hazards we're paying attention to and excluding other ones. So one of the things that happens over time is you discover that some of the things that you think of or that are deemed safe actually are creating these other hazards in another time frame or another place, you know, and a lot of times they're really big. And the poster child for that is climate change. So, like, there's nothing in the building code to address climate change. In fact, there's a lot of stuff in the building code that accelerates the impact on the climate. And when you try and address those things, you know, you get regulatory resistance. And it's because it's not a system looking at all of that stuff, and we haven't figured it out. So when accepted practices are shown to have serious unintended human or ecological consequences, the alternative shouldn't be resisted or merely tolerated. They should be pursued. You know, we need solutions, and the regulatory realm needs to partner with everybody else in finding these solutions and accelerating them. And it's slowly happening, and faster in some places than others, but it's really important. Also, we need to pay attention that the way we're requiring people to design buildings creates dependencies. So if you think of most buildings, when there's some disaster and they no longer have electrical power or gas or whatever, when they're disconnected from their external life support systems, they're uninhabitable or dangerous to be in, especially buildings with inoperable windows and on and on. So there's a concept, passive survivability, which is we should be looking at these buildings and making sure that in the eventuality that they lose their external support, that they're still safe and usable, that people can still be in them. And that's a real shift in thinking as well. And I would love to see the regulatory sphere, basically helping people find the best solutions, not just to focus on the worst things that we're trying to avoid. And there's another big issue, which is a lack of recognition, and this really showed up in the tribal work that we did with EPA, of the difference between not just suburban, urban, suburban, rural, really rural, island communities. It's way different from mainland tribal communities. The codes are not structured. They haven't been developed to deal with a lot of that stuff, and they need to. The International Green Construction Code was a start, but it's a standalone code. I was involved in developing this code, what I really wanted was for these things to be integrated into the regular code, not a standalone, overlay code that is optional, but it takes time. So one of the things that came out of our work with EPA was we started looking at, one great thing is the tribes are basically sovereign nations within the U.S. And so we could explore a bunch of these things with tribes that are really difficult to do with cities and counties and states in the U.S. And so we sort of came up with this idea about this sort of evolution. So you have traditional codes which are protecting, that's inner circle of things that I showed in the microscope slides, human health and safety in buildings. And then green building codes which add protecting the natural environment and some elevated concern about human health and toxicity and indoor environmental and air quality, etc. And then you could have tribal codes, so they do all that while also respecting, protecting, and expressing cultural and traditional values and practices. That you could actually have, codes that are looking at a bigger sphere of things. And this seems really relevant to a lot of the cultures here, that we're talking about here. And so one of the things that came out also was that there are really, and I heard this from so many different tribal members and different tribes that we talk with, that they're dealing with two worldviews. There's the modern reductionist, industrialized, Western worldview that sees the world as a collection of resources for human exploitation. And then there's this common indigenous worldview that sees this sees everything as living, as related. It's about relationships. It's about caring and respecting and honoring these things, in a really different way. And what I realized was, this is a really different starting place for talking about things like building codes and standards and things like that. And so we had the opportunity through EPA, Timony and Michelle Baker, her colleague there, to work with a tribal working group on this stuff. We developed a tribal green building code website. I had been involved in developing this years ago, this sustainable design and green building toolkit for local governments. And I kept saying, we need the same thing for tribes, and it'd be really different. And one of the things that happened was we got to do that. That EPA also, as we focused attention on that old one, they updated it, which is great. So the toolkit is available. It has case studies and checklists for tribes with and without codes. It covers all these different things. I'm going to speed up. It's based on a lot of questions, and then it has lots of references and resources and links out to all kinds of deeper technical information. Years ago I came across this thing, the County of Maui actually developed this code for these indigenous structures, and I was just thinking, gee, potentially, it would be interesting to look at some of the traditional ways of building on other islands, and potentially looking at the concepts they were based on and how we might integrate some of that into with modern materials, etc. Just thinking about all of that stuff. The International Code Council produces this whole set of codes: the building code for commercial, the residential code, fire code, plumbing code, mechanical code, energy conservation code, fuel gas, etc. Existing buildings. There are lots of codes. Thank you. I see it. one of the things is code books are expensive, but that you can get access to them for free online. And so there's a website, you can see it says free view or buy. And it's kind of clunky, it's slow to use because they want to sell code books. But you can get access to all the iCodes online for free, which is important. So just quickly, the residential code is a prescriptive code. The idea there was that home builders would have a single book that would cover everything, energy, plumbing, all of it in one book. So it has lots of drawings and diagrams and graphics. The building code, which is the IRC is for 1 and 2 family dwellings less than 3 or 3 stories or less, I think. The building code is a performance-based code with some prescriptive provisions in it, but it's basically more for like engineered designs of things. The energy conservation code is both, and it's for residential and commercial, but there are both prescriptive and performance paths for that. And in 2015, they changed it so that residential provisions in the IECC and the residential code are identical. They weren't for a long time, which was really problematic. There's a performance code, which is a great piece of guidance for dealing with stuff that's not in the code. And it's sort of a full-blown version of the alternative materials and methods and designs provisions, but it gives a lot of tools for how to go about approving stuff. And one thing about it is I recommend people adopt it and use it for when they run into a problem on a project. They want to be able to permit, but they're sort of stymied in how to use the prescriptive or the other codes. It's a great resource. And the codes have appendices. The 2018 IRC has a really good radon appendix, Appendix F. And one of the things that changed between 2015 and 2018 was it was originally just passive radon control, and now it includes active systems for that, which is good. I'm going to skip this. So energy code is not my specialty, because there's zillions of people who know a lot more about that and have focused on it. There's some great resources. This will all be available to you in the PDF file, so I'm going to skip through it rather quickly. There's a tropical zone now, which I think is important. Hawaii, so DOE has some really good guidance on this stuff, and so does Hawaii. So it's, there are good resources out there for that. This is an awesome thing I came across. A friend of mine, David Marr, is a world-class seismic engineer, and what's been happening is FEMA is basically, they're looking at kind of a performance-based and impact-based look at seismic. So basically they're saying you can create these more expensive systems so it's casualty risks, chance of a post-earthquake placard, which basically says you can't use this building or you can only use this part of the building. Expected downtime after an earthquake, initial cost, repair cost, and the carbon impacts of the repairs. And so this is a really interesting kind of different engineering approach. And the ASCE is working on a similar one for high winds. And I just want to, I'll end with this, that in 2015, the president of the University of Guam said that our biggest export in Guam is money. $300 million a year leaves Guam's economy to buy petroleum-based fuel. So one of the things to think about is energy efficiency, renewable energy, all of these things, waste reduction, all of that stuff. These are all tied together. And one of the things they address is exporting your wealth off island. So renewable energy is a wealth generator where the wealth stays in your community. And I think it's really important to think. So I like talking about energy efficiency and renewable energy as local economic development engines, because they are jobs and all that, but they're also reducing the bleeding of all this wealth out of your community. And I think it's really important to get that. And insurance, if you don't have up-to-date codes, insurance companies charge you more than they do places that have up-to-date codes and good enforcement. I'm going to skip through this. So here, I'll end with this. This is an old thing. So the way to subvert the dominant paradigm is to have more fun than they do, but the really important part is they have to know it. Thanks.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Timothy. Actually, Timothy has a few words that she'd like to say, and then we're going to go into question and answer.
Yes, I just wanted to mention, I know that Guam is considering updating their codes to the 2018. IBC and CNMI has also talked about that, and in Guam, I think they currently have the 2009 codes in place. And in talking to David and other experts, 2018 is a huge leap forward in terms of energy efficiency and the overall building standards. So I just wanted to get that out there. This is quite complex and can be quite overwhelming, especially if you're not a building codes official. But if you're looking at kind of what you could do now that's kind of fairly straightforward, is bring your codes up to date with kind of what's the standard all over the world, the IPC. Yeah. Questions?
Thank you. And let me just say, before we get started on our questions, the intent of the PIEC organizers in inviting their legislators into all of these sessions was there's a lot of momentum on Guam for change and drive towards sustainability. And there's a lot of energy, particularly in the legislature right now. And the organizers of the PIEC wanted to invite into each session one of their senators. We obviously have Vice Speaker Chris Nelson, to listen to the sessions and hear what the audience was saying, what was coming out from not only Guam, but the rest of the Micronesian islands that are here. And to hear about that, and then of course if they had some questions, to be able to ask some of our experts. But I've been watching Vice Speaker Chris Nelson throughout. She's been scribbling furiously. So I think it's been a great session. I want to thank our speakers. And I want to ask the audience if they have some questions they'd like to ask.
I had a question about the end of the story about the gray water in California.
Yeah.
Was that happy ending?
So, mostly. So when in fact that, thank you. So the question was about the end of the story on gray water in California. And the reality was a lot of the public health people and the regulators, when that question got asked, and it did get asked, it actually had an impact. And so they went a long way, not as far as some of us would like, but it registered that they were, that they weren't paying attention to, the larger hazards. Similarly, a really interesting thing happened. Art Ludwig also pointed this out. So, the fires they've just had in California, like in Paradise and some of those fires, some of the other ones, where the fires have burned into relatively new subdivisions, one of the things that's happening is in houses where they've required fire sprinklers in every house, what happens is the houses that burn, there's nothing that stops the flow of water when the house is burned to the ground. In those situations, the fire sprinklers are not going to save a house. Nothing's going to save some of those houses. But what's happening is the houses that have burned are dewatering the whole system. So water's just bleeding out to all the houses that have burned. As the fire front, moves along, the fire sprinklers don't even work in the next houses because there's no water pressure. And nobody looked at, nobody ever thought, if we put fire sprinklers in every house without some system to deal with that possibility, because that wasn't a possibility. Fire is like one house at a time. But in fact, so it's a place where we built in a vulnerability that's gigantic without it ever occurring to anybody that was what might happen. So it's one more place where we're looking at part of the system.
I actually have a question too that I'm going to preempt and ask, and then we'll get back to the audience. From what you know about building codes, and this is for both Timony and David, from what you know about building codes in Guam and other Pacific Islands, what are some priority environmental impact areas that you think building code improvement could support?
Well, one thing I want to mention is this is a challenging place. When we had a conversation, I was delayed a day in getting here because of a delayed flight and a missed connection, but I was able to participate on the phone in the conversation with some of the people from DPW and anyway, hearing the list of things, 175 mile an hour sustained winds from multiple directions, that's pretty challenging. High seismic, termites, humidity, corrosion, high temperatures, all of this stuff, radon. This makes this a challenging, it's really easy to build in Tucson. Yeah, we have termites, it gets hot, but, it's like, we don't have very low earthquake risk, etc. So it's really different here. So you begin to look at materials, and what material choices there are, and it pushes you into another realm of how to think about what's sustainable. I think what's really important is to actually look at all of these things. When Timony was talking about, design for deconstruction, basically, so you can take buildings apart, I was thinking, well, that's really hard to do with concrete buildings. But maybe not impossible in total. And it's really interesting to look at some of these systems and look at materials. One of the interesting comments in that call was that termites are not interested for some reason in the wood and plastic composite lumber, which is so that that's not a material that's like high on my list of things. Although there may be a bunch of uses for that material here, where it might do well with the moisture and salt and all of that and termites. So there might be a bunch of potential uses for materials like that. But overall, the map of the water approval map process, I think it would be interesting to look at many things with that kind of an eye and just say, so here's what we'd like to do. What's stopping us from doing that? What changes can we make? And the other thing is that in a lot of places that have implemented or have developed really advanced and progressive codes for energy and other stuff, there's been a really good process of both starting out by educating people and having conversations, especially in the industry, builders, etc., designers, you know, and then creating a transitional strategy that might take a few years, creating some incentives, but helping people see that they can actually make those changes. And one of the interesting things years ago we saw happen with the Building America program, which is a DOE program, was that they got builders to pay attention to making design and, you know, and construction changes that cost them about $500 more per house to implement, by focusing on what Joe Stiebrich, this building science guy, developed this thing, a program. It was called The Cure for the Common Callback. And basically what it was focused on was that contractors, you know, or developers, they build these houses, and then over the first year or so, they get called back to fix things. And a lot of times it's comfort things, and, you know, so he basically said, make these changes, it'll cost you $500, but it'll save you the $1,000, you know, most of the $1,000 you're spending in the first year going back to fix stuff. And they'll be better, higher performing, and you'll make more money, and you'll have less liability.
Yes, and I just wanted to add, when we met with the Department of Public Works, they were saying a lot of the engineers and builders here, they're using the more recent codes, and they're eager to see the codes be updated. So I think, you know, first step, update the codes, get them current, and radon-resistant building codes where appropriate. And I believe the military is doing that kind of across the board because they see problems. But you all deserve that as well in your homes, to have them be safe. My sister-in-law passed away from lung cancer because of radon, and it's a common problem, mainland too, just incredibly elevated levels in some homes. And it's an awful way to pass away. So I just really want to encourage you to think about human health and radon-resistant building codes if that affects your island too.
I wanted to bring Vice Speaker Cruz Nelson into the conversation too. Timothy partially answered this already, because we did find out that DPW is looking at updating some codes as well as Bureau of Statistics and Plans. But with respect to potential new large developments on Guam, do you think that the current building and land use codes and other requirements are adequate to ensure developments and how they affect the impacts on your island?
Okay, this is where the truth comes out. I feel that we could do a better job as far as planning development on our island. We've seen within the past couple of years developers wanting to build, and then the community comes together and almost in a manner of being upset, saying, you know, this doesn't fit the cultural practices, the tribal practices that you spoke of. And so I think this is a good conversation that we are having. And to address I like your what-if approach, Mr. David's what-if approach, because it brings the building codes to life, and many of the things that he brought up as far as like reduced exercising also contributes to our health and can be detriment to our health. So these are some of the things, like we don't have sidewalks on Guam. There's no real full urban planning as we move forward to develop that I've seen. And I think that, you know, the leaders in the community, we can take a proactive approach if we pass policy to implement like better building practices, places that you build. In Tumon, they're still continuing development on a preserve. Just a couple months ago, a condominium went up and they are already exceeding the easement line, and they were able to build on top of the sand. And so these are some of the things that I see, and of course I bring awareness to the respectable agencies who allow them these permits, and for them to go and double check the work to see it is efficient. So I think we do need to focus more on our building codes and to really implement the 2018 codes that you were speaking of, Tony. We were addressing this last term, especially with the fire department, because they go out and they give these permits for the buildings or for the businesses to operate. And so the intent is to grandfather a lot of the existing buildings, but to also push the the additional developments, the new development forward to comply with the 2018 codes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hey folks, I know there's other questions out there. David and Timony are going to be around. I'm going to have to call this short because there's another session. Lynn, what are you doing shaking your head? Are you suggesting that we just camp here? Okay. Thank you. You've been a wonderful audience. Please join me in thanking our speakers who have been fascinating.